Did any of the following actually happen as described in these scary stories? Welcome to the Best of Dogman 2018 through 2020. I'm your old pal Bigfoot, and I'll be joined by PQ River, Madeline Starr, Nancy Levonian, and of course, Henrey Lee Dogman, as we tell you over 2 hours of the scariest Dogman stories in the history of this channel. Recently, one of you left a nice note about our earlier episodes, which are kind of hard to see on YouTube. You gotta put some effort into finding them. This episode features a bunch of Dogman stories that I didn't think got noticed enough back then, in 2018 and 2019, so we're giving them a second chance here today. Let's jump straight back to Christmas 2018 for 2 Christmas Dogman stories narrated by PQ River himself. But to get things in the Christmas spirit, here's a very handsome man-ape type critter. Hey, it's almost time for Christmas. Ah, and everybody knows what that means. 2 Dogman Christmas stories read by Dr. Death starting right now.
To those of you who have sent us scary Christmas stories, the 2 I'm going to read this episode both have certain weird similarities with each other that seem to make them go together, even though they took place in different areas and during different eras in time. Both are accounts of Dogman menacing families in their own homes on Christmas Eve. It's not a thing I'd ever heard of before, but apparently it happens more than anyone could have expected. We actually have one more story like this, which we might put out in a future episode. Is Dogman attracted to the smells of a feast, or is Dogman something evil that instinctively hates Christmas, the way old movie vampires were supposed to hate the sign of the cross? Just some of the questions these stories raise. So, stoke the fire or turn your heat up, get a cup of hot chocolate or eggnog, and settle back to enjoy
2 Christmas Eve Dogman Tales.
Santa versus Dogman is told to Peter Bernard, read by PQ River. When I was a kid, we celebrated Christmas in a very un-Christmassy way in our cramped little apartment in the city. Our weirdo landlord banned lights and decorations and didn't even allow Christmas trees. He said the real ones were a fire hazard, the fake ones needed to be stored in the summer, and he wasn't providing us any storage space in his basement because our rent didn't cover that. I bugged my parents every year to have Christmas in an old-fashioned way in the country. I never would have done that, though, if I had known it would lead to a terrifying encounter with an actual, real-life werewolf. Christmas in New York in the 1970s was pretty awesome for the most part. My dad had some dumb office job, but it paid enough that I got all the toys that I wanted each year, plus a couple I hadn't even asked for. I had subscriptions to all the superhero comic books from both DC and Marvel, and I had every Spider-Man, Batman, or Superman toy that existed up to that point. The year before, I got a Pet Rock, Pong, and the Evel Knievel dragster toy, which I played with every day until February when it broke. Christmas season was palpably happier in my hood back then. Everywhere you walked, Christmas lights and plastic Hanukkah candles created an awesome vibe of excitement and commercialism mixed with an ancient-feeling mystery. A Charlie Brown Christmas, quotes from scripture thousands of years old, but was produced originally as a half-hour ad for Coca-Cola. To me, in that era, Christmas was both the most trendy and the most archaic. It was the most crass and the most sublime simultaneously. And then I'd go home, and everything looked the same as any other time or season. So finally one year, Uncle Isham from South Carolina, who I had never met, phoned my mom and asked her if we wanted to spend Christmas out at his place in the country. He asked us every year, but this time was different, as he said he needed to spend the holidays at a hospital out of state getting some sort of surgery performed. Mom said he asked her to watch the house as a favor to him and to make ourselves at home and really enjoy the place as our own, since he wasn't even sure he'd ever return. Poor, kind Uncle Isham. Dad managed to get the time off of work, and the three of us climbed into a rented car and drove down south. On the way there, Mother explained somewhat guiltily why we had never taken Uncle Isham up on his offer to spend Christmas with him before. It seems old Uncle Isham was a bit of a character. For one thing, he operated a moonshine facility. It had been handed down to him from his father and his father's father, who had both operated it since the days when such things were illegal. Most of Mom's family hailed from Maine, but Uncle Isham was from the side of the family that moved south generations ago. They were largely eyed with suspicion by their northern relatives, in spite of the fact that our southern cousins have never been anything but warm and welcoming to all of us from up north. I imagine there's a backstory there, which most likely has been lost to time. It was probably best left there. When we got to the house, it was just as rural and out of the way as I had expected, but its interior was a lot more modern and badass than any of us would have foreseen. It was very clean inside. It had hot and cold running water. All the electricity worked fine. The fridge was stocked, and there was a second coffin-sized freezer in the basement, also full to the top with edibles. There were 4 bedrooms to choose from, each one with satellite TV in them. I could swear they had Wometco home theater, but I might be conflating it with home box office. But there was a movie channel and one of the Turner channels, and I think Christian TV and not much more. This was even before MTV, so there wasn't much to watch. Apparently no TV stations close enough to pick up by antenna in this neck of the woods. At any rate, we happily ate anything we felt like and watched movies all the first afternoon and evening that we were there, which was Christmas Eve itself. When it came time for bed, I was not feeling sleepy. I asked if I could stay up and wait for Santa, but I was told that if Santa saw me up, I wouldn't get any presents. This got me into bed quickly, but I still couldn't sleep. I started counting all the kids on TV shows who had seen Santa but still gotten presents. Could my parents be wrong about that? Besides, isn't meeting Santa a present in and of itself? I wanted to get up and wait for Santa, but it seemed like I would be taking quite a risk of getting on the bad list. Then I heard it. The front door. The doorknob on the front door was turning. Santa! My heart was beating out of my chest. It felt larger than my entire body. Meeting the real Santa would be worth 2 years of presents. I gathered all my energy and tore out of bed toward the front door. I did not hesitate for 1 second in opening the door. My grandchildren don't believe this part of the story, as they all know never to open the doors to strangers, not even Santa. I guess the smarter kids of my generation knew that as well, but I was convinced I would come to understand the mystery of Christmas on this trip to the country, and I knew for a fact that I would be opening the door to Santa. Except it wasn't Santa. It was a wolf. I gasped and tried to close the door, but the wolf was larger than I was and easily knocked me down and climbed into the house over my prone body. I screamed and immediately heard my parents calling out to me. Now I was half kneeling, half standing, half in and half out the front door, shivering because of the cold and stuttering because of fear. My parents ran out of their bedroom and stopped short just a few feet in front of the wolf, who then did a most unexpected thing. It tilted its head and front half back. I could literally hear its bones cracking and snapping out of and into place as it seemed to grow taller in front of our eyes. What had been A tall wolf was now a huge monster, standing somehow on its hind legs, the tips of its pointed ears nearly touching the ceiling. Once it was done with this painful-looking process of standing up, it howled. It was a howl and a bark, or maybe a scream. It was a vocalization to end all vocalizations. I looked to my mom to see what she would do. Mom looked to Dad to see what he would do. Dad stood there, wet his pants, and began crying. I was now certain that we were going to die. That's when we heard a terrible crash as something fell hard into something metal somewhere very close by. The sound startled us, and my mother and I both screamed. My father fell to the floor in a duck and cover position as though we were being bombed. Even the Dogman seemed startled. We all looked at the fireplace as, with an even louder sound, a very dirty-looking Santa Claus fell down, knocking everything over and shouting out words I can't repeat. "Sorry about the noise," came a scratchy voice shout from the smoke and dust. "I forgot to open the flue first." The Dogman, utterly spooked, split through the open front door and was gone in an almost supernaturally fast way. I ran toward the fireplace to help Santa, who was still using words I didn't expect to hear from jolly Saint Nick. My mother grabbed me by my collar and held me back from the chubby figure, asking him who he was. Sitting up, with a silly, drunken smirk on his face, the dirt-covered Santa asked her, "My child, don't you remember your old Uncle Isham?" So it turned out Uncle Isham made up the story about the hospital to trick us into spending Christmas with him and his terrifying homemade alcohol. I still to this day have never tasted it, but on our third night here my father got so drunk on it that he peed on the bookcase thinking it was a urinal. I loved Uncle Isham. He was funny day and night, whether sober or not. In the morning he'd make the rolls dance like Charlie Chaplin, and at night he would drop to the floor and spin in a circle like Curly Howard. Never again, ever met anyone like him. He had fun every waking second. We asked him about the Dogman, and he just thought we were pulling his leg. He never saw it when he was busy falling down his own chimney, and he had never even heard of such a creature. We never saw it again the rest of our time there, and believe me, I was always looking for it. My father issued a family law that we were to never discuss the Dogman again, but every single time they fought after that, Mom would bring it up. When faced with a chance to defend his family, he had begun crying instead. Poor Dad never lived that down. I'd say it was a hallucination, except the three of us saw it, and it literally knocked me down and walked over me. My mother had a theory that it just was a mutated wolf that was hungry and smelled our food, but I think it was something evil, and it was drawn by its opposite, which is good. Christmas is sort of the celebration of the ultimate good, the possibility of peace and enlightenment for every consciousness. Why would that not attract living manifestations of the darkness? Some of my relatives insulted Uncle Isham for being irresponsible, but he was full of love. He loved all of us with every ounce of his soul, and so that's why the Dogman ran from him. This is because the darkness can never defeat the light. At least I hope not. This next one has 2 Dogmen in it, so stay tuned for that. Dogman Santa is told to Peter Bernard, read by P.Q. River. This is an absolutely true story from history, confirming that we have always lived with Dogman. My grandfather used to tell me this when I was a kid back in the 1970s. It was a story that he said happened to him when he was a boy my age. which was back around 1910 or something like that, I guess. He and his family lived out in the country on a little isolated farm with no electricity, so this story could almost have taken place any time in history. Any time in history after the character of Santa Claus came into existence, at least. Now, I had thought Santa was an advertising image invented in the 1930s by a sugar manufacturing company or something like that, but my granddaddy said no. He always insisted his family and everyone he knew talked about Santa Claus or Santy Claus, and that he had a beard, wore a red suit, and came down the chimney on Christmas Eve. Grampy said he believed in Santy Claus because each Christmas morning there would be a present from him in his stocking. I did some Googling, and it turns out Thomas Nast was drawing a fairly modern version of Santa way back in the 1860s, so that backs up my grandfather. One winter, back in the early 20th century, was especially tough for my ancestors, and Gramps overheard his mom telling his father that she hoped Santy would bring them a better crop next year. His father responded that if he didn't, they would lose the farm. Grampy says his mom cried. Eavesdropping on the incident put more than a little bit of shock into him. He knew something he wasn't supposed to know. He felt somehow responsible to fix things. That Christmas Eve, after everyone went to bed, Grandpa snuck back out to the fire and quietly put it out. His parents had forbidden him to go near the fireplace unless they were supervising, but he felt he was doing this for them. He wanted to make sure Santa was able to get down the chimney. If he hadn't, then the family might lose the farm, which was the only life they knew. Santa had to come down that chimney, and when he did, my grandfather was going to plead his case with the jolly old elf and beg him to help them in their time of need. So, Grandpa said he sat in front of the fireplace, wrapped in blankets, as the house got increasingly colder and colder. He hoped Santa would get there before the cold woke his father up, and that he could get the fire started again before his mother noticed what was happening. He was doing it so she wouldn't cry anymore, but there was no real way to explain that part to her. It would be easier if he could pull this off, without her ever finding out. Onward, onward, into the night, Granddaddy kept guard in front of the fireplace until, finally, he dozed off. He noticed he had been sleeping when he smelled a dead animal and woke with a start. He heard a growling sound from directly in front of him. Focusing his eyes, he saw the strangest thing he'd ever seen. It was the head of a dog, but it was upside down. It was the upside-down head of a very large, very dark, very unhappy-looking, yellow-eyed dog. Next, he said, he noticed blackness oozing down around the head, and he realized there was a large dog coming down the chimney. He had put out the fireplace fire, and he had let in a large, hungry, feral dog. Suddenly, there was a sharp bang at the front door. Santa was using the front door. The nightmare afoot from his face was immediately forgotten. Santa solves everything to a sleepy boy. Relieved, Grandpa ran to the front door and flung it open. But Santa wasn't there. What was there was another strange sight. It had odd legs bent backward like a goat, but with claws instead of hoofs. No, it was not Krampus. It was an animal. It wore no clothes, yet it stood like a man. It had gray or brown hair or fur all over its body, with a speckled pattern over much of it, like spots or stripes of some kind. kind of like a cat more than a dog. It held its arms in front of it in the way a dog does when it's begging, but at the end of the arms were no paws. At the end of the arms were hand-like claws. Granddaddy says he just stood there for a few seconds looking at the thing, and the thing stood there looking back at him. Then, according to my grandfather, he just closed the door politely, turned, and walked away. That was always my favorite part of the story. He didn't scream. He didn't get into shock. He didn't soil himself. He didn't faint, and he didn't run away. He saw the dog man, and then he was just like, nope, and politely closed the door. Now, the dog man, he wasn't as polite as Granddaddy. He started throwing his body into the door, and on the third try, it flew open. Cold wind and snow were sucked in everywhere as the silhouette of the werewolf creature filled the doorway. The huge black dog from the fireplace had risen to its full height and joined this new one. The two were growling and walking slowly toward him, both on their hind legs, like hairy forest people. Grandpa said he remembered them being extremely tall and having to bend over to go through doorways. He never took a guess as to their height, but to me that sounds like they must have been at least 7 feet tall. My grandfather says he was still half asleep, and his reaction was not to wake his family, but to wrap himself back up in his blanket and cover his eyes so that he could not see what was happening. He heard the dog man breathing and the wind blowing. He heard them take a step in his direction. He could smell the creatures. It was the smell of large animals, plus the smell of old blood caked into their fur. He could hear the huge animals growling and getting nearer. Granddaddy made peace with his life and prepared to rejoin his maker when he heard a thud on the roof. Peeking out of his covers, he saw the dogmen were also staring up at the ceiling. Another thud and another came down from overhead. Granddaddy said he could hear either voices or some kind of animal noises from up on the roof. It was Santa and his reindeer. What else could it be? At that moment, the dogmen both panicked and ran out the front door. Grandpa says he slammed and bolted the door behind them as they left and prepared for Santa to come down the chimney. The next thing he knew, it was daylight, and his mother was scolding him for being out of bed. He experienced missing time of several hours. He was back wrapped in his blanket by the fireplace, and his mother was restarting the fire. When he told her what had happened to him, my great-grandmother told him it was just a dream. Granddad, though, knew it could not have been a dream for several reasons. First of all, he found a present in his stocking, proving Santa had been there. Second, part of the wood on the front door jamb was broken away, as though pushed in from the outside, proving the dogman had broken in. Third, and to Grandpa, the most important proof of all, the crop came in strong that next year, just as his mother had asked Santa for. Now, Grandpa used to tell me this story to convince me that Santa was real, and that's why I should be a good boy and always obey my parents. However, what I got out of it was that if you stay up late and do whatever you want, in spite of your parents' wishes, you might get to see a real-life dogman.
Man Wolf of the Woods, as told to Peter Bernard, read by Madeline Starr. My daddy bought a cabin near a large stream in the woods about a year ago that was supposed to be a fun place for me, him, and Mom to get away to. It was supposed to take stress out of our lives. Even the first time we went up there, I felt a very weird sense inside me that I shouldn't be heading in that direction. This was my parents' last summer with me before I went off to college, though, so I wanted to do what was right for them if I could. Dad was feeling very excited and was cracking all his old jokes, which Mom and I tried to laugh at. Mom also seemed a bit off to me. Maybe she was feeling some of the same things I was. Suddenly, a dog ran out in front of the car and Dad barely swerved around it. "Where did he go?" Dad was glaring in the rearview mirror, then shouted, "Oh sure, run away after I almost killed my family swerving around you." He was yelling at the dog, who I couldn't see anymore either, out the back window. Mom put her hand on Dad's arm. "Maybe we don't need to be in such a rush. Maybe we can go slower and enjoy the scenery," she suggested. "As opposed to running the scenery over. Is that what you're getting at, dear?" Dad was red-faced. He never called Mom dear unless he was extremely angry. They bickered for a while. So I put on my 3-hour-long white noise MP3. I keep it on my phone for these exact situations, and leaned back to take an afternoon nap. I began dreaming about being there in the back seat, napping, while a pack of dogs chased the car in the night. Dad was oblivious to this as he drove, and I couldn't tell him, because in the dream I was sleeping and therefore immobile. In the dream, Mom nervously told Dad to speed up, and so in response, he spitefully slowed the car down, pulled off to the side of the road, and announced that he was going to go relieve himself. I tried to will myself awake as the dogs surrounded the car and barked at us angrily. They began putting their front paws on the car, getting their muzzles right up against the window, and growling or barking at me and Mom inside. Behind them, I saw the Egyptian god Anubis walking by in profile. I don't think I would have recognized him from any other angle. I focused all my energy on waking up, and when I did, it was silent. The car was parked like in the dream. I was laying down in the back seat. Mom seemed to be in the passenger seat. Dad was missing. I sat up quickly. "Where is Daddy?" I asked Mom. She gave me an odd look and pointed toward the clearly empty driver's seat. I wondered if I were still dreaming. Then I realized she was pointing out the driver's window at something outside. I followed the direction she was pointing and saw the silhouette moving toward the vehicle. I gasped in horror, then laughed in relief as I saw it was just Dad, and he seemed to be carrying bags of something to eat with him. We were not parked alongside the road as in my dream. We were in the parking lot of some fast food chain open all night for truckers and, apparently, my lost father. I asked him why we were still driving in the dark. I had thought the drive wouldn't take this long. Dad sheepishly admitted that he had taken a wrong turn at Albuquerque. I knew he was quoting Bugs Bunny, but I played along. "Oh no, Daddy, you mean you drove us all the way out to New Mexico?" He said that we weren't even a half-hour away from the cabin, but I reminded him he had told us that the last stretch of the trip was a 1-lane, unlit dirt road through dense forest. And I asked him outright if that might not be wiser to wait till morning to drive down. Dad insisted he had been here twice before and knew the way like the back of his hand. Obviously, if he knew the way so well, we'd have already been there. But I kept my mouth shut. Mom pointed out the chain store motel right next to the place Dad had just bought his food, and asked if we couldn't just stay there and finish the trip in the daylight. In response, Dad abruptly started the engine and angrily drove to the exit of the parking lot, not even touching the sandwich he had just unwrapped to eat. We idled at the entrance to the highway as incredibly fast-moving, evenly spaced cars went by. One, then another, then another. The highway wasn't really that busy, but the cars were just barely too close together for Dad to merge into traffic easily. I stopped looking left at the highway traffic and gazed right, down a long stretch of grass that separated the highway from the food and lodging area. There was a dog there. It was 100 or 200 feet maybe, in a shadowy area, but I could see it, darker than the darkness. Then I realized it was running toward me. "Daddy, let's get going. Daddy, please make the turn," I choked out. "Don't worry, sweetheart. Daddy's only waiting for one of these imbeciles to let him in." I tried to get my mother's attention instead. "Mom, look." She instantly saw the dog as it emerged from the shadows, snarling and baring its teeth ferociously as it ran toward us at top speed. "Henry," she gasped, "floor this heap right now." Dad started saying stuff about how he's glad we're excited to visit our new cabin, but he had to wait for BAM! The dog hit the side of our car at full speed, snarling and trying to bite through the window in an insane way. Saliva and foam were all over the glass. "Drive, Henry!" screamed Mom. Dad drove crazily out into traffic, with one of the other cars swerving and screeching to avoid hitting us. The dog momentarily lost us, but as Dad turned the car in his direction to join the flow of traffic, the monster caught up with us. It was big and it was black. It had pointed ears, but they flopped over at the ends. It was not a breed I had seen before, but it was really large, like Marmaduke dog, but black and with a long, thin snout and huge teeth. "That thing is rabid!" Dad exclaimed as he sped up the vehicle and slowly outpaced the creature. If there's rabies in the area, then that dog is not the only animal that has it. So much for a relaxing 2-week vacation in nature. I wondered what the rates at the hotel and the shopping center were, and if Mom and I could afford to sleep there instead. The rest of the trip was incredibly spooky. Finding the dirt road off into the dense trees, driving through utterly pitch-dark woods on gravel until we found the cabin, which looked at night like the set of a horror movie. And although walking from the car to the house was one of the most terrifying moments of my life, nothing happened. The electricity was working inside the house. There was cell phone reception. Well, some. And the interior of the horror movie cabin was lovely, clean, and modern. I remember thinking that as long as we kept the rabid monsters locked outside, this cabin might do as well as the hotel. That night, I dreamed again of the dogs surrounding our car. I looked for Anubis, but could not see him. The next day, Dad went back to that same area with the hotel and fast food, because apparently in the daylight, there was also some kind of giant discount food store there as well. He asked us each to make a list, which we did, and off he went. After he was gone, Mom asked me if I wanted to go for a walk in the woods till Dad got back, and I looked at her like she was crazy. I wouldn't go out in an area with rabid animals, unarmed, and Dad is the only one who knows how to use the gun, I said, referring to the pistol I know my father keeps in the drawer next to his bed. He did bring his gun, didn't he? That's a good question, Mom answered, adding, "We should ask him that when he gets back." She didn't try to get me to go outside anymore. Instead, she turned up the AC and lost herself looking at the Netflix menu on TV. I put on my white noise and looked out each window, trying to understand the geography surrounding me. Then I used the very mediocre Wi-Fi to slowly download maps of the area. Although it felt like we had driven through a lot of forest to get here, on the maps we looked extremely close to civilization in that one direction. In the 3 other directions, the maps and satellite photography just showed trees and trees, stretching on, forever, basically. I suddenly felt like we were on someone else's turf. There was an old science fiction show on TV once about a colony in space that got wiped out because they set up camp on a planet already claimed by this other tribe or species. I thought about trying to explain my feelings to my mother, but when I started formulating the words in my head, I realized it sounded like I was saying we were invading the planet of the rabid dogs from ancient Egypt, and I realized all of this was just a feeling inside myself. If I could decide to feel a sense of foreboding, I could decide just as easily to feel a sense of good luck and adventure. We all decide how we are going to feel, I said to myself. So let's just decide to feel happy right here and now. And for the most part, that worked for me and my mother. We spent the next week and a half indoors, giving Dad our shopping lists and binge-watching a lot of series and movies in the comfort of air conditioning. Dad would sometimes barbecue out behind the cabin, but he'd always end up coming in suddenly at the end. Early on, he tried to get us to go for a walk in the woods with him, but neither of us was interested. He went alone, but we insisted he take his gun, which he had indeed brought with him. While Mom and I were enjoying vegging out, Dad was stressing out. One night in the second week, my father started making dinner very early. He wanted to barbecue, but clearly wanted to be finished with it before dark, for a reason he didn't tell us. Even though he succeeded in bringing everything in before the sun went down, he still seemed really unnerved all through dinner. Then suddenly blurted out that he was ready to go back to the city any time we were. It came out so unexpectedly that I didn't know how to respond at first, and it seemed Mom felt the same way. But it only took a moment to recover, and both of us said we could be packed to leave by the morning. Dad asked if we wanted to leave that night. Honestly, I had been living out of my suitcase just so that I could be ready to go at a moment's notice, and I told him I was down for any eventuality. That's when something bumped the house from behind my father, directly in front of me. Then something bumped the house behind me, directly in front of Dad. "It's too late, isn't it?" asked my mother. Then she asked it again, and I could see the fear had gripped her. I gave her a hug and told her everything was fine. Then I turned to my dad. "The barbecue," I said. "They want the barbecue. Throw the rest of the barbecue out the back, and we should be able to exit from the front." Dad looked at me dumbly. "You know about them?" Actually, I didn't. I was imagining this was a pack of dogs stressing my father out. But I now realized it was because that's what I had seen in my dream. In fact, I didn't know what was harassing him. "Is it coyotes or dogs?" I asked. Dad snorted. I had guessed wrong, apparently. "It doesn't matter. Your plan is better than any I can think of. So you and your mother get all your stuff and stand by the front door when you're ready." And so we did. As I've said already, I didn't have much to pack, so I grabbed my suitcase and headed to my parents' room to help my mom as soon as I could. That's where I saw him. It was Anubis. Out of my mother's window, I saw what looked to me like the silhouette of Anubis walking parallel to me. I don't think I'd have recognized him if he hadn't been in a perfect profile, as the Egyptians painted him. Then he turned and seemed to be looking directly at me. I couldn't be sure because he was obscured by the darkness. It seemed to be a man, but with the head of a jackal or coyote. Then it walked into the light just enough that I could see that it was either a tall man in a strange costume, or it was actually a dog that stood like a man. I didn't get a clear view of its legs, but when it walked, it just seemed normal, like a man walking. Now it stood there, studying me as I was studying it. I realized I had been transfixed when my mother bumped into me and said, "Let's go." She hadn't seen it. I followed her out of the room, and we both stood by the front door. Mom said to Dad, "We're ready." Dad had been looking out the windows in the back of the cabin, and it seemed he had mainly been looking in the same direction I thought I saw the upright walking dog creature. "Wait till I say go," Dad told us, then cautiously opened the back door of the house. He took one timid step outside. "We saved you some barbecue to show you that we're friends." Dad spoke loudly to the silent woods. "I'm gonna leave it right here, and you can have all you want of it on my dime. Okay, friend?" Dad dropped the food, yelling, "Go!" as he ran back into the house behind us. Mom somehow got stuck opening the door, and Dad was soon there, opening the door for us with his left hand, while holding his gun with his right. Then, the three of us tore into the car, which of course wouldn't start. We locked all the doors as Dad tried again and again to get the engine to turn over. "Please," he whispered. "Please, baby, just start." The large, jackal-headed man I had seen before walked out from behind the house, and he had these dark dogs circling him, running around at his feet. They were all different kinds of dogs, some of them large, others small and cute, but they were all very dark black. The one on its hind legs must have been 8 or 9 feet tall. It would have been tall even on all fours. Mom fainted and fell forward, banging her forehead against the dashboard. Dad got the car started and we drove away from there. 3 or 4 of the smaller dogs chased us for a little while, but the dog man just stood there, watching us go. I reached around Mom and managed to get her sitting upright with her safety belt strapped on. Dad was crying in the driver's seat, but he was driving okay. So I just turned around and watched the road behind us to make sure we weren't being followed. Dad was able to sell the cabin pretty quickly and didn't lose too much money, from what he told me. Of course, Mom and I were sworn to secrecy about the reasons why we were selling the place, and this is the first time I'm talking about it anywhere. I kind of feel like the new owner should be warned, but Dad says, "To the buyer beware." Mom says she's going to put that on his tombstone. I just hope it doesn't go on the tombstone of the new owner. After all, the only reason we even got out of there with our lives is that it turns out the dog man has a taste for top quality barbecue.
That dog man is not a dog man. As told to Peter Bernard, read by your old pal Bigfoot. Okay, this is a story that happened to me around 10 years ago when I was a senior in high school, so forgive me if I can't remember all the details perfectly. It was a long time ago. Basically, I and 3 of my friends took a shortcut toward the mall that went through a patch of forest. We got involved in talking and ended up sitting on a rock in the middle of the path and chatting instead of continuing on our way to the mall. This part of the path was surrounded by a few trees, but mainly this very tall grass that was way over our heads. Maybe 9 feet high. I guess it was some kind of grass. It looked like wheat stalks, but I know it wasn't that. Maybe it was just some kind of tall weed. Anyway, it grew thick as a rich man's front lawn and tall as an elephant, and suddenly peeking out from right near the top was the face of a very large and apparently very tall dog. I'm using the word dog loosely. It was a canine-shaped head, and it seemed to have small, pointed ears on top. It was darkly colored, with front-facing, evil-looking eyes, just where you'd expect a dog or a wolf to have them. But a dog or a wolf doesn't hold its head 9 feet off the ground. To say that we were alarmed is to make a severe understatement. We were panicked, but we also didn't know what to do about it. We had wanted to head toward the mall, but the giant dog was now standing in that direction. Retreating in the direction we came meant a whole hassle, and we probably wouldn't end up getting to the mall at all. We were now all standing up on top of the rock, as though not touching the dirt would somehow make us safe. Maybe if it thought we were as tall as it was, it would go away. But it didn't. The dog face just stayed there, looking at us, curiously. It felt like we were at an impasse for an hour, but it was probably more like 10 minutes. The dog's head kept darting into and out of the tall grass, appearing a little closer each time we saw it. The consensus opinion was moving in the direction of us running back the way we came. Then, suddenly, apparently with no provocation at all, the creature pounced out into the pathway and confronted us, hissing. Yes, I said hissing, like a cat or a reptile. This was not a dog at all. The dark, canine-like head was connected to an equally dark, bipedal, upright-walking, dinosaur-like creature. It had man-like arms it held out in front that ended in yellowy, torn-up claws that seemed like they had ripped a lot of things apart in their time. You could see the creature was not covered in dark fur at all. It had a scaly skin with tufts of feathers in places, like around the neck. I think we thought it was a dog, because our minds were filling in the blanks, trying to make sense out of a situation that was nonsensical. We were projecting a dog out there, but we never actually saw one. The ears on top of its head weren't ears, they were horns. I barely even saw the dinosaur, to be honest, because I did not stay to get a good look. I just ran. We all did. We ran back the way we came, which we probably should have done 10 minutes earlier. I can't tell you details about its tail or anything. I assume it had one, but I don't remember if I actually saw it. I did see its claws, and that it had powerful-looking legs. It was almost all black, but it had some areas with red striping. Don't ask me where, I just remember seeing some dark red striping. It was a sleek-looking creature. The dark coloring would almost completely camouflage it if it hunted at night, as well as concealing it from humans. Animals like this could probably exist for years in an area without even being noticed. And if they were noticed, they might get reported as dogmen. That's what we probably would have told people if it hadn't pounced out at us. We each had different memories about what happened when we ran. Two of my friends say the monster grabbed at them as they ran, and one said he almost tripped when it swiped at one of his feet. My other friend and I were in the lead, however, and since we never looked back, we had no idea if the creature was behind us or not. It's like that old saying, I don't have to outrun the bear. I only have to outrun you. Well, we outran them. Unfortunately, they outran the dinosaur/dogman. So you might think we never took that shortcut again, but you might think wrong. Instead, it became a dare to go that way, and we did it practically every time. The same with the other kids at school who had heard our story. I never heard of anyone else ever seeing that creature again, but maybe someone did see it. Maybe they just didn't run fast enough. Don't go away, we've got an all-new Bigfoot story read by Dogman coming up right after this.
Do you have a scary story you want us to read on the show? Just call our voicemail hotline, 804-LIST-SCARY. That's 804-537-2279. And now for something completely scary.
Bigfoot sighting predicted by a dream. I had a dream about that old Roddy McDowell movie in which he played a vampire hunter. In my dream, he and I were in a haunted house hunting for a vampire. I remember he stopped me from walking on a staircase, then pulled a chain hanging from the ceiling. A door opened up from the bottom of the stairs, like the compartment the monster's pet dragon used to live in. We walked inside, and there was a cold, cobweb-filled stone tunnel system down there. I noticed how the stones in the walls were taller than we were, and Roddy told me this place was built long before the birth of humanity by giants. No wonder it's haunted, I remember telling him. He nodded sagely, agreeing with me. We eventually found a chamber with coffins strewn about unceremoniously. This must be the lair of the vampires. I handed Roddy his stake and wooden hammer, which they always used to kill vampires in all the movies. He opened the first coffin and smoke billowed out. Not dust, but an intense, thick smoke poured out, covering Roddy so completely that I couldn't even see if he was still there. Struggling to breathe, we both broke ancient-looking stained glass windows and climbed out to an outside that still looked like the interior of a movie set in an old Hammer horror picture. We could breathe easier here, and we laid on the ground recovering. Suddenly, Roddy began a horrible transformation, like the way Lon Chaney Jr. would transform on camera in time-lapse photography from the Larry Talbot character into the Wolfman. Only Roddy wasn't transforming into a werewolf. He was transforming into his old Planet of the Apes chimpanzee character, or a more realistic version of him. When he was fully transformed, he turned to me, glaring and growling. This was not the witty British chimp of the movies. This was a long-fanged, animalistic, half-ape, half-man creature. And for some reason, it was angry at me. I woke up in a panic, drenched in sweat. Pulling the covers from myself, I immediately got cold and began shivering. My bedclothes were completely wet from the bad dream, and since my room was cold, I was now losing body heat quickly and shivering uncontrollably. I got up to get dry clothes to change into when I saw it. Outside the window, I saw it. There was a man there. Or maybe there was an animal there? It wasn't Roddy McDowell, whatever it was. And whatever it was, it didn't like the fact that I was looking back at it. It charged at my bedroom window screaming. I don't remember anything after that until I woke up shivering violently and sneezing a few hours later when the sun had come up. I was laying on the floor freezing to death. I gave up on the dry clothes idea and jumped into a hot shower instead, bringing my body back to normal in no time and making the experiences of the night before seem nothing but imaginary. That night, when I went back to bed though, something was knocking on my wall. Not once, not twice, but all night long. That was my last night in that building. I got a room in a completely different town the very next day, and I'm happy to say I have never dreamed of Roddy McDowell ever since. Don't forget, we got another Dogman story coming up at the end, but first, Nancy Levonian has a scary story right after this. In the description of this video, we've got a link to our new Scary Stories t-shirt. It's our classic skull logo, and it says Scary Stories underneath in the Kaiju Monster font. It comes in black and also black and other dark colors, such as black. Good for ladies or gentlemen, hoodies too, whatever you need.
The Man Who Was Darkness Itself, as told to Peter Bernard, read by Nancy Levonian. If I live till December, I will be 62 years old. This is a story that took place in the summer of 1967, so you do the math. Now, those of you who have studied ancient history know that 1967 was the summer of love, in which most young adults were experimenting with certain kinds of chemically induced experiences. But I have to assure you, I didn't try any of that till the 70s. At this point, I was a cigarettes and liquor kind of girl, as were all my friends. On that night, however, we were over at my friend Mary's house, and she lived with her parents still, so the only thing we were drinking that night was Great Shakes. Google that if you have the time. Great Shakes. It wasn't scary, but it was delicious. I was married, and had been for almost a full year already, as soon as I graduated college. Back then, you married a man with a good-paying job, or you became a teacher or office girl. My parents sent me to college so I could marry a better educated man, not to train me in a professional field. About half of my girlfriends were married already too. It was a different time from now, obviously. It's funny how priorities and taboos change over the years, because back then, the Ouija board was considered a kid's game like Monopoly. Mary's younger sister and her friend were trying to play with it, but nothing was happening. They asked us to try since we were older. Maybe we could get that weird heart-shaped thing to move. Mary's friend Sylvia and I sat down on either side of the board, and as soon as we placed our hands on the board, it started moving. It went from the letter L to the letter O to the letter V to the letter E, spelling out love. We all laughed at that and started talking like hippies in a joking way. Peace and love, man, we all said to each other and had a laugh. So I thought that Sylvia had moved the thing and she thought that I had moved it. We went back to the board and this time it spelled out, I love you. We all thought that was sweet and someone asked who the board was saying they loved. It spelled out most of my name. Then Sylvia took her hands off and gave me a dirty look. So, she told me I wasn't being funny and refused to play anymore unless someone else replaced me on the other side of the board. So, Mary sat down with Sylvia and one of the kids asked the board again who it was in love with. It spelled out my name again. Both Mary and Sylvia looked at each other with questioning eyes. Neither of them was making it move. Someone or something else was. I felt thoroughly creeped out and wanted to go home. Mary and her dad said they'd walk me home, since it was about 10 minutes away through the path in the woods and it was a nice night for a walk. We got a few blocks into the walk and I felt incredibly strange. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I'd never had that feeling before. I looked over my shoulder and I could swear I saw a shadow on a tree. Then on another, then another. It looked like a shadow of a man, but I couldn't understand where the man was who was casting that shadow. It really looked as though the man would have had to have been between us and those trees. And for the shadow to be that large, it would need to have been cast by intense, large light source very close to the ground. It looked like the kind of shadows you usually only see in the movies or in comic books. Really long, like those cast just before dusk when the sun is low in the sky. Only, this was nighttime in the forest. The only light was the full moon overhead. I remember it was windy because I had to hold my dress down or else it would blow up. I remember the wind rustling through those trees. Yet, the shadow seemed to hold its shape no matter how the leaves blew. It looked almost solid, as if the darkness itself could have been solid and real. I guess that's the best way to describe it. It was a real, living shadow, and it was following us. I pointed the shadow out to the two of them, but they didn't seem to be able to see it. I'm not sure they knew what to look for. I asked them to pick up their pace, but they didn't share my sense of alarm, and so we walked excruciatingly slowly back to my home. When we got through the woods into my old neighborhood, the street lights were a welcome sight. The shadow didn't seem to follow us out of the forest. I lost sight of it and forgot about it, anxious to get home to my husband. That night, I was awakened by the bed being shaken. I remember opening my eyes and seeing the shadow of a man across the far wall. I thought it was being cast from the bedroom window, but when I looked outside, nobody was there. Where was the man casting the shadow? Was I dreaming? The foot of the bed slowly lifted, maybe an inch or two off the floor, then dropped suddenly. This woke up my husband, who told me to stop shaking the bed. When he spoke, the shadow became larger. It seemed to grow up the wall, then onto the ceiling. It was growing taller and wider, and its head was moving up the ceiling in my direction. I screamed! I screamed like I never screamed before or since. I screamed, and I shook my husband, and I pointed at that shadow until he looked. And he saw it too. I had told him about what had happened earlier that night. It turns out he was listening to me, as he stood up at once and told that shadow straight out that I was his wife and I was taken. He He was sorry if the shadow loved me, and he understood why he would, because I was a fine woman. But he saw me first, and he was going to keep me. He straight out challenged that thing to fight over me, but it just kind of went away. Like, it didn't slide away or fade out. It was just like 1 minute my husband was screaming at this thing, and in a while, the moment was past, and we both just went back to sleep as though nothing ever happened. The shadow thing never came back. I didn't play with the Ouija board for a while, but not because of what had happened. I think a couple years later, I played it with someone at a Halloween party, and it only said nonsense. So I never had a bad experience with it again. My husband, God rest his soul, always used to say that playing with the Ouija board is like opening the front door of your home and having a conversation with whoever walks in. This explains why it could be such a completely different experience each time you mess around with it. These days, I live alone, and I have plenty of locks on my door. I don't answer the doorbell unless I'm 100% certain I know who it is. And for similar reasons, I never play with the Ouija board.
Don't go away, we got one more Dogman story coming right up. The Giant Bird and the Dogman. As told to Peter Bernard, read by your old pal Bigfoot. My great-granduncle went insane. He had been the town doctor, but after that, he became the town drunk. The story was that it all happened one night after he saw an actual Dogman and an actual Thunderbird battle directly over him as he laid there, helpless to extricate himself or to get to safety. This is the absolute craziest story in my entire family history, and we have a pretty crazy history. There's the one ancestor who fell off a roof and onto a picket fence, piercing his heart but somehow not killing him. There's the ancestor in Harlem who killed an alligator in the sewer and had a handbag made out of it for his wife. My mother still owns the little bag, which is a handmade, original, alligator skin purse. But I'm not sure how to prove it's from Harlem. Maybe see if it likes jazz? I don't know. I wouldn't have believed the story myself, but my mother told it to me one day while we were cleaning in our attic. The way she told me made me pretty certain that, no matter how crazy sounding, there was probably some kind of real truth behind this story. So this all took place in some tiny town in Texas, I think in the late 1800s or early 1900s maybe. According to the story, my ancestor was very cruel to his dog. He would beat the dog for the most minor of offenses. One time, when walking home from visiting a patient, the dog did something which bothered him, so my doctor ancestor started whipping the poor creature. Finally fed up after years of abuse, the story claims that the animal grew into a 6-foot-tall werewolf, who then chased his tormentor home through the woods, intent on revenge. I kind of wonder if that part of the story was a fable to explain the appearance of the werewolf-like creature. Maybe the dog didn't turn into a monster. Maybe my ancestor just randomly got chased out of the forest by a dogman one day. The creature is so rare and so strange that it would be natural for the local people to assume some sort of magic was associated with its appearance. According to the family legend, he fell out of the forest, exhausted, onto the ground, unable to run any further. He was about to be finished off by his own dog, transformed into a dogman through his own acts of cruelty. As he prepared to meet his fate, giant talons reached down from the sky, lifting him up and attempting to carry him away. It was not the dog at all. It was a giant bird, larger than any bird known to currently exist on this planet, probably a prehistoric throwback of some sort. According to the story, this bird was large enough to lift a grown man into the air and might have carried him off to be eaten if the dogman had not intervened, grabbing back my great-granduncle as his own kill. My ancestor fell hard to the ground, and the wolfman stood on him as he fought off the vicious, swooping attacks from the immense bird. My ancestor's back got all torn up from the werewolf's claws, and he lost enough blood to pass out. When he woke up, the monsters were gone, but so was his mind. He was never the same again, never able to practice his craft as a doctor, and never able to function normally. So my mother paused dramatically at this point in the story and looked around the room for a while. Then she took off in one direction, opened a big box, and came back with something in her arms. "You know, your great-granduncle spent his last years in a mental institution," she said, even though she knew I had no way of knowing that. Then she handed me what she had gotten out of the crate and told me that was where he painted this. It was a painting, an outsider art kind of a painting. There was a bird. It was on a house, but it dwarfed the house. There was a wolf coming up to the house and the giant bird. This was the story she had just told me, illustrated in front of my eyes. I guess my great-granduncle was real. I guess there really was a time when a dog man battled a thunderbird with one of my ancestors as the prize. I noticed I spoke really quietly back then. Maybe I was afraid of waking the audience up or something. Glad I learned to speak up since then so I can tell you about the lovely individual who is executive producer for this episode. Her name is Kath. She's good at math. She helps us out to stay on the path. Yes, this episode was brought to you by Kathy Barrickman, who is one of our favorite channel members. Kathy gets to see our secret, scary, uncensored stories we do for channel members only each Sunday night, and you can too by joining our paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com, or by doing what Kathy Barrickman did and clicking the join link under this or any of our videos. You'll get special perks, and you'll be helping us to stay alive, which is not as easy as it once was. And now for something completely scary. Welcome to Scary Stories NYC. I'm your old pal Bigfoot. Here with me is Henrey Lee Dogman. Hey everyone, Happy New Year. Why do you always scratch yourself like that? Do you have fleas? Are you trying to say something bad about flea-infested individuals? No, never. Anyway, Flea Boy here and I were Skyping before the show, and we kind of challenged each other to see who can make up the scariest story on the spot. I can easily come up with a scarier story than you on any day. Yeah, right. I lost the coin toss, and Dogman chose to have me tell my story first, so wish me luck. Well, what? Aren't you going to wish me luck? I thought that was just an expression. Besides, no, I'm not going to wish you luck. I want to beat you. That's not very sportsmanlike of you. Sportsmanship is for primates. I'm canine, remember? I've known some frisbee-catching dogs that were excellent sportsmen. Why, I even... Okay, good luck. Are you happy? Now can you please tell your story before we all die of old age? Fine. Settle back. Turn out the light. Find a warm spot. And look deep into my eyes as I tell you the story of the Wolfman at the cabin door, told by your old pal Bigfoot. Once upon a scary time, there was a man who lived in Briar Hill, Pennsylvania. That's not far from the town of Chestnut Ridge. One night, while driving on the Pennsylvania Turnpike toward his cabin located outside of Keisterville, the man sighted a strange light in the sky. He said it seemed as though the light was following him, but he was aware that could sometimes be an optical illusion if a light was bright enough and far enough away at night. He pulled over to look more closely at the light, but something inside him told him not to get out of the car, and so he just restarted the vehicle and drove the rest of the way to the cabin, which he shared with his uncle. Arriving and finding the uncle missing, the fellow walked around the cabin calling his name. He got no response at all, but felt uneasy standing alone in the dark, so he went inside. This happened in the early 1980s, so it's not like he could call his uncle's cell phone. Smelling tobacco smoke, he noticed a cigarette burning itself out in the ashtray. The ash on it was almost as long as the cigarette itself, so it had been abandoned almost as soon as it had been lit. Looking around, the man noticed that some things were knocked off shelves onto the floor. He set about neatening with the ever-growing fear that something had caused his uncle to flee the premises without any advance warning. He didn't know what had happened here, and he was just a short drive from home, so he was tempted to go home and call his uncle's place to see if he had done the same. Maybe he was watching the football game. Maybe everything was all right. Against his better judgment, some inner part of the man convinced him to wait for 1/2 hour to see if his uncle would return. If he didn't, then fine, go home and call him. If he's not at home, then call the police and report him missing. He wondered how long his uncle would need to be missing before the police would view it as their business. So the time passed slowly for the man. He sat there and shivered even though it wasn't really that cold. He resolved to chip in and get phone service installed in the cabin so that he wouldn't feel so cut off when he was there. His thoughts started drifting to trivia, like maybe getting a satellite dish out there too, when he checked his watch to see how much time had passed. 93 seconds. Before he even had the time to feel exasperated, there was a knock at the door. Or maybe not a knock exactly, but something more like a bang. Yes, let's say there was a bang at the front door. The man jumped out of his seat and made a little exclamation like a small frightened child would. The sound had startled him, but he realized it had to be his uncle, so a wave of relief spread over him and he laughed at his own fear. Almost running to the door, the man threw it open and found not his uncle. It wasn't even a man. Before he saw the thing on the other side of the door, he smelled it. In the split second before the man could look outside, sense memories of being at the circus when he was a kid flooded back to him. His mother had taken him backstage, where he was overwhelmed with the odor of all those caged animals. It smelled like the circus was on the other side of that door. That was not a good thing to be smelling in this context, and the smile melted off his face. He was already slowing the opening of the door before he saw what was out there. But when he saw it, he slammed the heavy wooden frame back shut. In that fraction of a second, the thing he saw frightened him so much that the man fell backward and found himself too uncoordinated to get right back up. He felt instantly ice cold from fear and found it hard to operate his limbs or fingers. When he finally righted himself, he was leaning against the back wall of the cabin, sitting on the floor. He found himself unable to stand, and his hands and legs were shaking uncontrollably. He spied a blanket on a nearby bed and wanted to wrap it around himself for the warmth. He pushed himself to stand and immediately fell back down, banging his head on the side of the bed. Now the man was in a lot of pain, and he was seeing double, but the injury had somehow slowed down his heart and breathing, and he was beginning to be able to think logically again. What exactly had he just looked at? He went over the details in his brain, rerunning the scene on the VHS player in the man's 1980s mind. Facts about what he saw. It was something that smelled like the circus. It looked wet on its face. Its face was very dark, like a black bear. It was not a black bear. It was not a gorilla, but it had a black face like one. It was an animal, not a man. It was drooling, and its tongue was hanging out. It panted like a dog. The nose or snout was long, so this thing had to be a kind of a dog. Its face was up higher than the man's face was. Its chest was level with the man's face. It was bipedal, but it was not a dog. The man started to laugh. Such a thing doesn't exist. Such a thing couldn't possibly exist. The man laughed and it felt good, but still, there was this nagging feeling in his mind as he returned to normal consciousness. If that thing outside wasn't really a bear-sized upright walking dog, then what was it? His laughter slowed and stopped. What had he seen? Maybe he should open the door and look again? But what if it was some kind of strange-looking bear? What if it was a man-eater? Still, if he could only get one more good look at the thing, at least he would know what he had seen. At least then he might have enough information to decide how to act, and besides, his curiosity was beginning to overcome his shock and fear. The man stood up, holding the wall for support until he felt he could walk. Then he took one unsteady step toward the door, and something banged hard again on the other side. That's when the man dropped to his knees. He wasn't praying. He just wasn't strong enough to stand anymore. The fear came rushing back, flooding his nervous system and drowning his ability to use anything besides the lizard parts of his brain. He made an unintelligible noise that he had intended to be a word. Which word? He had already forgotten. The man could hear the beast now, walking outside. It was coming around to his left and would be viewable outside the window soon. He would soon get to look at the monster as long as he wanted. But once he saw it, he didn't want to look at all. There it was, outside the window, a creature so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it. It made a sharp, abrupt move toward the window, screaming its head off, and the poor man lost all consciousness until the morning. Waking up on the floor with various bruises, the man was happy to hear bird noises and to see the early morning sun. He had survived the night, but immediately after his relief came the remembrance that his uncle had gone missing just before the creature sighting. He had to get up, get home, and call the police to tell them about his uncle. He would have to find a way to tell them about the monster too, but he debated perhaps telling the authorities that it was a crazed bear that menaced him instead of what he actually saw and smelled. Raising himself to his feet, the man got the shock of his life as, sitting on the chair right in front of him, was his uncle. Since he thought he was alone, the sight of anyone sitting there almost gave him a heart attack, but of course, then jubilation quickly set in that his uncle was not dead. Standing up and running over, the man noticed with horror that his uncle had a very distant, dead expression on his face, and also that he was completely unclothed. The man and his uncle never hung out again. Not in that cabin, not at either of their homes, not even on Thanksgiving or the holidays. If you asked either of them about it, neither of them would supply you with any information at all. So to this day, nobody knows if the uncle had been victimized by the Dogman that night, yet managed to get away, or if the uncle was the Dogman himself. Okay, Dogman, now it's your turn. Can you tell a scarier story than that? Was that true? Stop trying to change the subject. Tell us a scary story. So does that mean you made it up? Well, I don't know that it's not true. So you made it up. I thought that was the point of the challenge. We were supposed to improv a scary story and top the other guy. Look, I went first, so you have all the advantages on your side. Can you tell a scarier story than that? Well, my story is scarier than yours because my story is true. Allegedly. Allegedly, of course. You know, for legal reasons, you gotta say that. And what is your story called? My story is about the most hideous, disgusting, scary creature of them all. Bigfoot, of course. And it's called the Hypnotic Bigfoot, presented by Henrey Lee Dogman. A woman and a man were living on a property down in Oklahoma. It was a forested area and their house was in a rural location. At first, both of them were excited and honored when they both spotted a Sasquatch, or what appeared to be one, standing just inside the wood line surrounding their property and staring back at them. Neither of them took much mind of the fact that their beagle hid in a corner and whimpered through the episode. Both the man and the woman believed that Bigfoot was a friendly and shy creature that wouldn't hurt a fly, as they had heard on television. That night, the woman left scraps from their dinner out just inside the wood line where they had seen the creature that morning. The next morning, both of them got up early to look out their window, hoping to see something looking back at them. They looked, but they saw nothing. The longer they looked, the more they felt ill. The woman described it as seasickness, and the man told his friends that he felt like he had swallowed too much rubbing alcohol. They felt as though they were in trouble, as though they had done something improper. The woman told the man that a voice in her head told her they had disrespected the Sasquatch by only offering him scraps as though he were the family dog. She and her husband agreed that from then on, they would give the Bigfoot the same as what they had themselves, the same that they would offer any guest. That night was a cold one, so the woman threw on an overcoat before bringing the food outside. When the man saw her a few minutes later with her coat off and neatly folded at her feet as she was beginning to disrobe, he ran out and dragged her back inside. She had no memory of anything after she left the food out by the wood line. This was a troubling development, to be sure, but it all happened so suddenly that the idea of leaving hadn't occurred to either of them yet. Just a day prior, they had been proud to be visited by a Sasquatch. Now they had begun to wonder just what the powers of the beast were, and what else it had in mind to do with them. Mind. That's the key word, of course. They were beginning to understand that whatever Sasquatch was, it had some kind of ability or capacity to mess with their minds. Possibly this was a byproduct of their presence, or possibly this was a directed attack on their nervous system. None of this was anything that either of these people had ever spent a single second thinking about in their entire lives. And now, they were awaking to the realization that this could very well be a life-threatening situation. That next morning, they looked out the window again, but they sort of peeked nervously around the corner through the window. The entire mood had shifted considerably from their first sighting. The dog still cowered and whimpered in the corner, only now the humans could relate and felt like doing the same thing themselves. Until, with no advance warning, the dog yipped happily and began wagging its tail playfully, bouncing around. Before either person could do much other than notice this drastic change in behavior, The dog ran down the stairs at top speed. Both of them ran after the dog, dread growing in their hearts as they worried what was going to happen next. The dog burst through its doggy door in the kitchen and playfully ran toward the woods, toward that spot in the woods. The people ran as fast as they could, and the man was able to leap and grab the dog by its back leg about 20 feet before the wood line. The dog squealed and struggled to get away, and when the man pulled him closer, he even bit and scratched the man to try to get free. But the man loved that dog, and he held on as hard as he could and ran him back into the house. They put him in his dog carrier and got on the phone, arranging to leave him with a friend for the short term until they could figure out what to do. The man argued for increased security on the property or erecting a fence, but the woman wanted to move immediately. This was not something they could really afford to do, so it meant they would need to sacrifice until they could sell the property. They agreed the man would drive their dog to their friend's house, and then the woman would get on the internet and find them a cheap room to live in until the house was sold. And so the man drove to their friend, who lived over an hour away. He stayed for a while there, explaining details of the dog's treatment and catching up with his old pal. Then he drove home in under an hour, getting lucky with the traffic. Only when he got home, the woman was not there. He reported her missing and a huge manhunt was launched. Almost immediately after the search began, a huge storm hit, washing out roads and making any further searching impossible. And to this day, that woman has never been seen again. The end. That wasn't as scary as my story. Yes, it was. No, it wasn't. Of course it was. Your story had the person come back at the end. My story had the person disappear at the end. Disappearing is much more mysterious than appearing. Yes, but the challenge wasn't to be mysterious. It was to tell us, whatever. Maybe yours was scarier. We can let the viewers decide in the comments. Agreed. See you next time, and Happy New Year, everyone.
My boyfriend was a shapeshifter, as told to Peter Bernard. Read by Madeline Starr. I'm the kind of woman who gets what I want when I want it. If I can't take it myself, I get someone to get it for me. If I can't be appeased that way, I run to my very rich and powerful daddy, who starts firing people until someone gets me what I want. So, of course, when I met Einars, the mountain man, I wanted him as my new toy. And when he refused me and utterly rejected me, I had no choice but to fall madly in love with him. I did what anyone in my position would do. I hired the best private detective money could buy and began investigating him. We had determined that every single Thursday afternoon he would go to a particular restaurant for an early dinner. I waited a month to let his paranoia settle, then accidentally ran into him there at that eatery. He did seem surprised to see me, but not upset about it. He even invited me to join him at his table, which I did. We talked amiably, and he was quite cordial for a man of his breeding. He never flirted with me once, which was extremely frustrating. Nevertheless, I pressed onward in my attempts to charm him. He only made polite comments in return, then started checking his watch ever more frequently. He started interjecting that he would have to leave, so I redoubled my efforts to engage him in conversation. It would take a month or two before I could arrange another chance encounter like this. I didn't want all my effort to amount to nothing. I kept him there 20 minutes after he'd paid his bill. Then he suddenly got the strangest look on his face, stood up, announced loudly that he had to leave, and burst out of the establishment. I quickly followed, and he led me on a crazy car chase through the hills to the suburban part of town he was renting a house in. He screeched his car to a halt in front of his home, emerged from his vehicle in a great haste, and took a few steps toward his gate before convulsing in a most horrific manner. From my car, I watched as he bent down a man and then stood up again as something else. His head now looked like a dog, and his entire body was covered in what appeared to be fur. Then he howled a monstrous scream, halfway between man and animal. And raced off, bounding off the hood of my car into a patch of trees on the other side of the road and disappearing from view. After catching my breath from this most unexpected experience, I thought to myself what any woman would think in my position. I can save him. And now this Einars came to be my boyfriend. I had learned his secret, but I still loved him. Slowly, he returned my love. We live a mostly normal life like everybody. Summers in Cape Cod, winters in Aspen, you know. But Einars, as you by now must understand, has an affliction. It's called lycanthropy. In short, he turns into a dog man each month under the light of the full moon. So far as Daddy's team can tell so far, it's an incurable disease, but it can be treated. For instance, we discovered that if we kept Einar sedated and sleeping through the full moon, the symptoms never manifest at all. Einar calls me his angel. He says if a cure for lycanthropy is ever found, it will be a result of my caring for him. So he's happy, see? And I have my own pet werewolf. Talk about status symbol.
This year, we've all got something to be thankful for because PQ Ribber is here, playing his famous character, Dr. Death, reading 2 scary stories for us, starting right now.
My Son Talks to Dog People was told to Peter Bernard, read by PQ Ribber. My son talks to dog people. He's done it for as long as he's been talking to me. His mother and I figured it would go away in time, and it still might, but it definitely hasn't happened yet, last I heard. For now, at least. My boy Timmy talks to dog people. When he was 4, he used to tell me that they were from outer space. One day, when he was telling me about them, I asked him if they were from the dog star Sirius. He grew very serious and glared at me. "They told me you would ask that question," he hissed out at me through clenched teeth. Then he ran to his bedroom and slammed the door behind him. I stared at the closed door, with its "All Dogs Go to Heaven" poster staring back at me idiotically. I'd had disagreements with my son before, but never anything like this. From that point on, he claimed that the dogmen were not from space at all, but instead were from under the ground. She's actually my boss at my job. More accurately, she's the boss of several of my bosses, so she is even more of a type A personality than I am. Therefore, we got our boy a shrink. Not just any shrink, but a ridiculously overpriced shrink. The best kind of shrink if you want to impress your neighbors. This was the worst mistake we had ever made, and the worst mistake we ever could possibly make. At night, in the cab, coming home from his first therapy session, Timmy refused to speak to me. When he got home, he refused to speak to either of us. We ate dinner in silence. Then he retired to his room to play. The situation depressed my wife so much that she held me, and we both just cried. It was to be our last peaceful moment. At exactly 2:59 a.m., according to my alarm clock, a tapping began on the glass of the bedroom window near my side of the bed. At first I told myself it was a tree branch, and in my dream I could see a branch tapping against the window. Then the sound happened again, and I woke up enough to remember that there is no tree by that window. This is as good a time as any to describe the layout of our house. Although Timmy slept upstairs, and although we kept intending to move ourselves up to the master bedroom, my wife and I were actually still sleeping in the smaller room downstairs we used as our home office. Why exactly this came to be is a long, boring story, and our tendency to place our jobs above everything else in our lives meant we had never focused on our own needs enough to get our bed up the stairs and create a normal bedroom to sleep in. So we slept in the office and used the larger upstairs room as a temporary storage area. Temporary as in for the last 2 years with no signs of ending. Dust was gathering on the stuff stowed in what should have been the room we slept in. Meanwhile, back in our temporary bedroom in the ground floor office, there were 2 windows, both of which faced out onto the lawn that ended with a small patch of trees that separated us from our neighbor's property. The only tree close to the house was up front. This room was in back. Sometimes we had seen deer wandering along the edge of the trees out back, which was sweet. Other times we had seen small groups of what looked to be coyotes from a distance. Although coyote attacks on human children are rare, they do happen, so we discussed getting an invisible electronic fence installed for the safety of our small son. We discussed it at the same times we discussed cleaning the master bedroom and getting someone in to move our bed upstairs. In other words, we had never installed any security systems at all. And so, anything that wanted to could just walk right up to our house and tap on the window, like something was doing right at that moment. I tried to see what was there without sitting up, but it was impossible. I knew I was going to have to at least sit up and more likely go walk in front of the window to see what was there outside my house, deliberately waking me up at 3 a.m. I sat up and looked. I couldn't see anything there. I rubbed my eyes and looked again. This time I saw a shadow. There was something there casting a shadow, but I was going to have to stand up to see what it was. Judging by the height of the shadow, I realized it had to be an adult deer, or a human being, or something else of that size. This was not a fun thing to realize. I had no weapon by the bed. I had not prepared for this kind of eventuality ever occurring. I reached to my nightstand and took my autographed Mark McGuire baseball out of its display case. Then I stood up. I was thinking I might be about to face a burglar carrying a gun, and my only weapon is the baseball my wife paid $500,000 to buy me as a birthday present. An entire lifetime of choices all seemed so silly at that moment. An entire lifetime of silly choices had led to this, and maybe would end here if whoever I was about to face was armed. Nevertheless, I stood up, took a step forward, and turned to look at what was tapping at my window. And there, on the other side of the glass, I saw an absurd sight. It was a furry. At least, that was my first impression. It was a man in a dog costume. It had normal human proportions, human legs, etc., but it was furry all over and had a dog head. As funny as that may sound, it did not make me laugh. Instead, it made me feel nauseous, and I had to fight my reflex to vomit right then and there. The mask had a tongue hanging out of it, a long pink tongue which curled up at the end. The man inside did an impressive job of appearing to pant just like a real canine would, with its tongue hanging out. How was he operating the tongue, though? I'm no expert on special effects makeup, but wouldn't a moving tongue that real require animatronics, or hydraulics, or some such thing? As I stared closely at the end of the tongue, I noticed saliva dripping off of it. The guy in the costume started growling at me, and I felt it in my feet and in my belly before my ears actually heard it. My gaze wandered up from his tongue, and when I met his eyes, he barked at me. I'm not very proud to say that his bark scared me so much that I screamed a high-pitched wail that woke my wife up. I tried to sit back down on the bed but missed, landing hard on my butt on the floor, still staring up at the whatever it was outside the window, who was still staring at me. My wife woke up, cursing like a truck driver and asking me to explain myself. All I could do was point at the window, but she was too busy yelling at me and ordering me to answer her to sit up and look at me on the floor, pointing at the window. I was still watching the tongue, panting and drooling. What if the tongue were real? It was the longest tongue ever seen on a man. Maybe it was a real dog tongue. What if the dog head was the real part and the man body was somehow a trick or an illusion? Could it be a puppet that a dog head was sticking through? I was thinking some crazy thoughts, but none of them were as crazy as what I was looking at. Around this time, I noticed that my wife was beating me on the shoulder and the side of my head nearest her. She was shouting things that I couldn't understand, but then I wasn't understanding anything that was happening anymore. I understood that my wife was angry at me, but that was sort of a given in our relationship. Her voice got so loud it hurt my ear. The special effects makeup creature outside the window took exception to my wife raising her voice and began beating the walls on either side of the window with its fists. Fists? I couldn't see them, but it sounded like fists, like the sides of hands, one on each side of the window frame, beating rhythmically and hard. Turning around, my wife saw, I guess for the first time, the reason I had accidentally awakened her. She never stopped screaming, but now the berating, insulting words had disappeared and been replaced by pure, unadulterated screaming of utter terror. The kinds of sounds that creatures made long before the invention of any language. I looked at her, and her entire existence at the moment was to breathe in some air to scream, then to breathe in enough air to do it some more. She had reached a high note, and she stayed right there on that note. And then the dog joined her. He howled, trying to match her note. Now I had two howling dogs breaking my eardrums. It was a werewolf duet. A werewolf duet. How funny. I started laughing, and it felt so good. So good to laugh. So good to laugh very hard. The silly dog man was singing with my silly wife. My son had been right all along. There really were dog people. He wasn't the crazy one. This was so funny. I was so funny. I laughed at myself. Ha ha, what a funny me. I no longer live in that funny house, with that funny window, looking out to that funny forest that the funny dog people live in. I no longer work my funny job with my funny wife as my funny boss. The whole place made me laugh too much, so they replaced me with someone who didn't have as good of a sense of humor, which is really pretty funny. I no longer know where my funny wife went to. I no longer know where my funny son lives, but I know where the dog people are. They're sitting right behind. You.
Got another PQ River story right after this.
Do you have a scary story you want us to read on the show? Just call our voicemail hotline, 804-LIST-SCARY. That's 804-537-2279. And now for something completely scary.
The Dog That Became a Man, as told to Peter Bernard, read by PQ River. I'm a newcomer to scary stories and cryptozoology on YouTube in general, but I've recently become fascinated by online accounts of Dogman and werewolf-type creatures. I've never seen such a thing myself, but it all reminds me of something my father told me when I was a kid. I never believed this story, and well, to be honest, I probably still don't believe it, but finding out that other people tell stories so similar to what my dad claimed he experienced has me thinking about it all over again. Dad is gone now. He's been gone since 2002. My much-beloved older brother was a fireman who died in the World Trade Center. It is all very hard, but it killed Dad, who didn't survive another 6 months after that. They called it a heart attack, but we all called it a broken heart. Dad was emotional. He could get theatrical. He was diagnosed as having panic attacks, so that when he actually had that fatal heart attack, his best friends surrounding him at the time did not respond quickly enough to save him. His own reputation for exaggeration may have been what killed him in the end. And it's that same reputation for exaggeration which caused me, and still causes me, to not believe the story I'm about to relate to you. That having been said, it was my favorite of all his anecdotes, and I remember asking him to tell it to me when we roasted marshmallows in our backyard at night in the spring and autumn. He would wince a bit at being asked. He didn't seem to like that I found it so enjoyable when he found it so painful. Or at least he acted like he found it painful to recount. I used to assume it was acting. Now I guess I just don't know. My family would go in the summers to stay a few weeks with Dad's Aunt Sylvia, my great-aunt, who never married but had a really nice place in the country with a few acres of privately owned forest surrounding it. Every time we went there in my childhood, my father would tell me and my brother this story in the car on the way there, as a cautionary tale. One summer, when my dad was young, he went out to stay at Aunt Sylvia's. One day in that particular summer, it was so hot out that Aunt Sylvia suggested he stick close to the house and stay in the shade. Aunt Sylvia was a get outside and get the stink blown off you kind of a grown-up, so if she was saying Dad should stay home in the shade, it must have truly been a scorcher. Dad did not want to stay home that day. He said he'd find shade in the woods and set off across the lawn. He said he started to feel really dizzy and barely made it to the edge of the forest before he sat down, leaning back against a tree, facing the lawn and the house, and fell asleep in its shade. He woke up to a dog licking his face and an adult male voice asking him if he was okay. He said he was, and then the dog gave a little yip of a bark and jumped past him on his left, brushing up against him as he ran into the forest behind him and the tree. He would tell us that he looked around and couldn't see where the person was who he'd been talking to, so he assumed that he, like the dog, had vanished into the forest. Just then, Aunt Sylvia was calling him back to get some lemonade. As he slowly came back to normal and gathered strength for the walk back across the lawn, he wondered if he had dreamed the dog. Then he realized he was covered in dog hair, and brushing it off, decided that the dog and its owner were probably trespassers who didn't want to get caught, but were kindly enough to make sure he was all right before departing. It was a story that seemed to make sense, at least for a few hours. That night, in bed, he woke up again to the dog licking his face. "How'd you get in here?" he asked. "Through the open window in the dining room," said the same voice he had heard earlier in the day. Shocked by the man's voice in his room, my father said he sprang up standing on his bed and looked around the entire room but saw no intruder. "Is this a game?" asked the male voice, which Dad now realized was coming from the dog. At this point, we would always interrupt him and ask him what did that mean the voice came from the dog. Like, was it coming out of a radio on the dog's collar? Was it coming telepathically from the dog? Was the dog mouthing the words like Mr. Ed on TV? Or was the lip sync better like in Disney cartoons? His answers were always vague enough that we needed to sort of fill in the blanks ourselves, but he did say that it was not telepathy, and he did say the dog spoke, as in the words were apparently formed by the dog's mouth. Now, I don't think that's possible with a normal dog mouth, or coyotes or wolves for that matter, even if they had a human brain attached, which they don't. But my father said this dog talked to him, and that they became best friends. So each summer, when my dad went to stay at Aunt Sylvia's, he would play all summer with this dog, who would take him on adventures through the forest and teach him things about what was there. In the summer when he turned 13, Dad said the dog, who he never referred to by name and never called anything but the dog, told him that this would be their last summer together and that they would not get to be friends anymore. This made my father sad and annoyed. On the day he was set to leave, he told us he saw the dog from a window in the house running toward the forest. He ran out after it, seeing it going behind a bush. Still running as fast as he could, he then claimed he saw a man with the same color hair as the dog coming out from behind the bush, pulling clothes on, and running away further into the forest. This caused him to stop running immediately and stand there, confused. Did the dog run past the man sleeping behind the bush and wake him? No. My father was convinced the dog ran behind the bush, changed into the man, and quickly put on the clothes he had stashed there while running away deeper into the forest. We would try to argue other possibilities to him, but he would tell us that if we were there and if we saw what he saw, then we would understand that this dog changed into that man. He said that it was the most unsettling experience of his life, and while he was happy to bring us out to Aunt Sylvia's, we were not allowed to play with or even touch any stray dogs that we might come upon. If a dog appeared on the property, we were to immediately go inside and call animal control. He made us both swear to this. I once asked him, if he was friends with the talking dog for his whole childhood, why was he so scared of us talking to it? He said it was because the dog had never been honest with him, and he never really found out what it truly was. If we don't know what something is, we can't begin to guess at its motivations, and we can't calculate our own safety in the situation either. Although the dog never did him any harm, he found the memories disturbing enough to warn us. I asked him to take us into the forest and teach us the things the dog had taught him, but he only repeated that these things were things that man was not supposed to know. So when we were kids, we figured he wasn't telling us because he didn't really know anything about the forest, and he was just acting like a big shot to impress us kids. We never did come across any stray dogs while out there, so that added to our notion that Dad probably had just gotten heat stroke and imagined the entire thing. But these days, when I hear stories on YouTube of Dogman and Goatman, they are often described as being evil or demonic, and that is definitely the way my father wanted us to feel about his talking dog/man encounter. If anyone has stories of a talking dog or a dog changing into a man, particularly if this story takes place in Pennsylvania, please forward them to me, care of this channel. I kind of doubt it, but maybe someday Dad's crazy old story will be vindicated after all.
I'm your old pal, Bigfoot, and this is some smelly old dog man. Oh, you're gonna call other people smelly. Yes, I can smell you through the Skype. So, Smelly the Dog Man here is gonna copy me tonight. I am not. You are too. I'm gonna tell you an all-new, never-heard-before Dog Man story, and then guess what he's gonna do? He's gonna tell you another Dog Man story. Yes, but mine is much better than yours. We shall see. And then, after this mongrel plagiarizes my act, we've got a very special surprise for you. You'll have to wait and see what that is. But first, let's get things started with a special email we received the other day. Dear Scary Stories, I think my parents are werewolves. Nobody believes me and everybody laughs at me. I told the nurse at school, and she told my parents what I said. I got locked in my room all night as punishment. My mother and father told everyone that I'm crazy and that they're seeking help for me, but they haven't taken me to a single psychiatrist. They know I'm completely sane. They know the same thing I know, that each month for 3 nights around the full moon, they both revert to a pre-human form, more canine than human. For 3 nights out of every 30, they feel the blood of the earth itself flow through their veins, and they become one with nature, with the most savage side of nature. Don't ask me how I know these things, I just do. For those nights, my parents become animals, and they need to consume other animals in order to satisfy their hunger. Until the sun rises, nothing and nobody is safe in their vicinity. These are not suppositions on my part. These are not guesses. These are definitive statements of truth. I know. If you need to know how I can be so certain, I'll tell you. The 2 of them passed their affliction onto me. On those nights, I, too, become an upright, walking canine predator, starved to death and hunting for dinner. And God help any of you who happen to be nearby. The end. Short and sweet but good. Let's see if you can top that, Smelly. You would need to stop chittering for a minute so that I could begin my story, which is called Yoga and Dogman, as told to and read by Peter Bernard. When my last girlfriend dumped me, she told me I needed to chill out and take up some kind of hobby that would allow me to access Zen, whatever that meant. I decided to take some classes in yoga. It might relax me a bit on the one hand, and on the other hand I might get to meet a new girl there. I've always been a type A personality, but I find New Age women attractive, so I'm very open to the idea of finding New Age concepts that can work with my very busy lifestyle. After about a month of taking yoga lessons, I had made friends with some of the women in the class. No girlfriends, but some genuine new buddies I could hang with and feel very comfortable around. One of them told me about this thing we have here in Missouri where you can go and do yoga in this wildlife preserve that saves wolves. So you can sort of do yoga with the wolves. That fascinated me because I had always described myself as a wolf when I was in my business mode. I saw wolves as the opposite of Zen. But here was a chance to combine the 2 energies and create something more positive in my life. None of the others were interested in going, so I made plans to go by myself. The event was very peaceful, and I got to see a different side of the carnivore watching the wolves there. I have to say I felt differently leaving there than I had going in. In fact, I felt differently than I'd ever felt before in my entire life. I still wanted the things that I wanted before, but I no longer felt pain at not having achieved these things yet. It seemed now that everything was complete in every moment, but we could still strive for other and greater things, same as before. We just didn't have to be in pain about the process while it happened. Every single step along the way can be as filled with joy and wonder as the conclusion. We don't have to wait until we win to celebrate. We can make the entire process of winning into one long celebration and prayer of thanks. In other words, my mind really exploded, and it was the greatest feeling in the world. I got in the car to drive home, and on a whim I decided to take the longer, scenic route through the forest. By the time I got there, though, the one 2-lane road through the dense woods looked kind of lonely and desolate. The sun was almost down, and the beautiful, friendly forest was beginning to look more than a little scary. Rather than feeling at peace in nature, I was starting to feel weirdly creeped out. I tried to get in the mood, but something was preventing me, and I found myself looking around and checking my mirrors in an almost paranoid fashion. Then, as I had begun to expect might happen, Something down the road in front of me came out of the forest. There was a large man-shaped animal down there, and I was going to have to drive past it. Chills went through me and every hair on my body stood on end. My conscious mind was very angry at my body and my subconscious for misbehaving like this. "I'm acting like a child," I stated out loud, trying to sound convincing. "There's nothing to be afraid of." Then I drove close enough to see what was up ahead on the road. Guess what? It was something to be afraid of. This thing standing there instantly struck fear in me on a primeval, prehistoric kind of level. This was something designed by nature to strike fear into any living creature smaller than it, and a few larger than it too, no doubt. This was a hairy, tall, bipedal Sasquatch-like thing, but I thought it had legs like a minotaur, and I knew minotaurs didn't exist, so my body just went cold with fear. I was seeing something impossible, which meant I couldn't predict what would occur next, and I wondered if something terrible was about to happen to me. Type A personalities like being in control, and you can't be in control when something like this is standing outside your car. I passed the monster, and I could see the legs were not those of a minotaur. They were dog legs, and the thing had a dog head. It was a dog, but one that stood up. I didn't know such a thing could exist. I've Googled and read all about Dogman since this happened, but on that day, my mind was terrified, thinking I was imagining this very realistic monster. Suddenly, I flashed back on my late father, who used to despise anything new or from other places. He used to tell me that meditation and yoga would drive me insane. He said they were like drugs that would create illusions and I would think they were real. I wrote off his blatherings as prejudiced and small-minded at the time, but suddenly I was wondering, was I hallucinating this creature? I'm trying to visualize the animal in my mind's eye so I can describe it to you. But I really only saw fleeting glimpses of it as I drove up to and then past it. One thing I remember clearly is that it was trying to make eye contact with me before I could make eye contact with him. It felt like he was trying to bore into my mind. I don't remember hearing voices or anything, but this was a creature who looked like he was trying to tell me something. I remember it as being gray, but I remember it being blonde as well, which is odd. I'm not sure if the undercoat was different from the overcoat of fur, or if it just looked different in places due to the darkness and the play of what light was remaining through the trees. The fur was sort of both dark and light, but not spots. The head was a dog head, like a German Shepherd, but not colored that way. I guess I don't mean German Shepherd specifically, but a dog face with wolf-like ears and a long snout. I don't remember a broad chest as I hear reported on your channel. My first impression was that this was not a human, even though it was standing on its hind legs. It really did not stand like a human or a gorilla or a chimp. It kind of stood like a monster. What I mean by that is that it had its arms in front of it with its claws reaching out, and it looked like a monster from an old black and white movie. Like sometimes they would walk with their arms out in front of them for some reason. The difference was that this creature had its arms sort of at rest in front, with its wrists bent downward. I remember thinking it had Halloween claws, although that doesn't really mean anything. I can't think of any real animals that have claws like that, maybe some do. But lots of Halloween costumes have claws like that, so I was going to try and convince myself that this was a prank, some guy in a costume. I was about to smile and laugh and let out my breath, which I had been holding this entire time. But after I passed the creature, it ran after my car. I had slowed down to view this thing as I passed, so I don't know if I was doing much more than 15 or 20 when it started to run after me. I felt a jolt of adrenaline pump through me and I hit the gas. As I sped up, so did the creature, dropping to all fours to run when I got over 30. It stayed behind me at an even distance until I hit about 40, then it couldn't keep up. The strangest feeling came over me, and for some unfathomable reason, I slowed the car down to 35 or so. The creature caught up and tried to come up along the right side of the car. Was it going to run me off the road? Would it attack my vehicle if I gave it a chance? Illogically, I drove a bit more to the left, to give it room to do what it wanted. The huge dog, running on all fours, ran along right outside the passenger seat window, and I could see in its eyes not hate and not joy, but this sort of very zen oneness with the moment. It wasn't just enjoying running alongside the car, it was born to be there at that instant. I looked and I saw what life would be like without neuroses or self-doubt. Was it playing with me? I started thinking and wondering what I should be doing instead of just being there with the wolf. I heard it growl and I saw it bare its teeth as it jerked suddenly to the right and ran straight between some trees, disappearing before I could even look around. So that was it? It was over already? I broke the trance by thinking too much. Why had I taken all those yoga classes and even the wolf yoga if I was going to... The wolf yoga. I just had a strange encounter with a Wolfman after doing yoga with the wolves. That was far too obvious to be a coincidence, and that was some kind of synchronicity. But what kind exactly? Was that wolf friends with the wolves I did yoga with? Was he waiting just for me that day? Did he suggest I take that route home? It was a half hour longer than another route I could have taken. Was that in some way a psychic event? Or maybe it was some kind of frequency or wavelength built up when I did yoga with the wolves so that the dog-headed creature and I were drawn to each other. So rather than him willing me to be there, maybe we both were there in harmony with each other's frequencies. Maybe neither of us had a choice. Then, when I went into my head and reverted to ego thoughts, I started vibrating on a normal human level again, and the dogman growled, then removed himself from my presence. I feel as though no matter what the literal explanation of that event might turn out to be, I was bestowed a great and rare honor. When I was in harmony and vibrating on the same wavelength or frequency as that creature, it was a very sublime state. It was beyond peace and beyond joy, and it was terrifying in the truest sense of the word. We say things like awesome so much that it hardly means anything anymore. When I was driving alongside that creature, I experienced true awe for one of the only times in my life. It was also, in an equal measure, extraordinarily frightening, just too much to take. It wasn't like one part of me was at peace and another part was panicking. It was as though all of me understood that this thing that couldn't possibly be real next to us might be the last thing we ever see. I knew this thing could push me off the road and eat me, but I didn't try to get away. Every split second of that experience made it worth the risk. So I told my friends about what happened, and they asked me when I was going to go back. I told them never. As much as it was the most amazing thing that ever happened to me, that kind of experience is the kind you're good with having only once in a lifetime. And if anyone tells you otherwise, maybe they didn't really meet up with the Dogman. What the heck was that? It was some kind of philosophy or new age stuff. What's scary about that? Maybe my story is beyond scary. Maybe my story borders on the profound, the profoundly smelly, if you ask me. What was that, folks? If you want a really scary Dogman story, just stay tuned because I'll be right back with another one right after this.
Do you have a scary story you want us to read on the show? Just call our voicemail hotline, 804-LIST-SCARY. That's 804-537-2279. And now for something completely scary.
Monday Morning Dogman, as told to and read by Peter Bernard. Years and years ago, back in the 1980s, the company I worked for transferred me to a different branch 3 states over, out in the country somewhere. I was staying in a hotel looking for a house to rent when I got shown a really weird kind of house that was located at the end of this long gravel road that essentially was just this house's driveway. Don't get me wrong, there wasn't much land around the house and I have no idea who owned the road through the forest leading there, but there was nothing else on that road and it only went from the house back down to the highway. So it was pretty isolated, yet inside it was fully furnished and even had food in the pantry. I asked what the story was and all the real estate lady said in return was that the previous tenants left quickly for personal reasons and were not coming back for any of their belongings. I was welcome to keep what I wanted and discard the rest. There were 2 beds, a large TV, a sofa set in the living room, and a table and chairs in the kitchen. I considered all this my good luck. I had no idea at the time, though, that the previous family had moved out because of Dogman. So, due to an odd series of boring circumstances, I ended up moving in on a Sunday morning. I just brought what I had with me at the hotel and I had the rest of my stuff sent on soon after. Since the place was furnished, I was able to set up quickly and tired myself out cleaning the place up. I was pretty beat when I settled in for a good night's sleep, but there was someone in the neighborhood who didn't care that I was exhausted. And that person happened to be a Dogman. Okay, first, the howling. The really loud howling that got louder each time, until by the 6th howl, it practically sounded like a police siren outside my window. I was picturing a dog or a wolf or a coyote in my mind, and I was wondering why its howls were not being met by the howls of other creatures. Then I got up and looked out the window, and I saw it. I saw a monster from hell standing by the tree line. There wasn't really enough light for me to see it, but I saw it. I noticed it immediately. It was almost as if it were lit psychically, if that makes any sense. If I took a picture, I bet that only shadows and blobs would be photographed, but my eyes could see it distinctly against the trees. The thing was too tall to be a man. I knew it was something else, but I wasn't sure what. A shadow being? It was moving back and forth, but not in the way I've seen Bigfoot do in videos. This character was sort of pacing back and forth. It was looking in the direction of my house, and I was pretty certain it could probably see me, since I had turned the room light on before looking out the window. I wasn't sure if it wanted to see me or if it cared about me. On the other hand, I wondered if maybe I was the reason it was there. After all, I was the new kid in town. Maybe this guy was coming to check me out. I had been awakened by the howling, and these are the kinds of thoughts I was having. It all seemed like a dream. Probably partially because I had been awakened from a deep sleep. I wasn't really sure at the time that this wasn't all just a very realistic dream, but I went with it either way because what else can you do? I tried to think logically, wondering what I should do about the howling shadow thing. At least it had stopped howling. Should I just go back to sleep? I was aware that this, whatever it was outside the window, wasn't supposed to actually exist, but on the other hand, I was really tired and I had to get up early in the morning for work. I decided to turn out the room light as though I were going back to bed and stood there watching to see what the creature would do. To my surprise, it immediately started running at a great speed toward the house. Once out in the yard, I could see it was a dog, but it was running like a man. This was an absurdity that turned my stomach upside down and I had to run to the bathroom and be sick for a while. I remember almost passing out in there. That's how ill the situation had made me. I had that moment of amnesia, almost blacking out, forgetting who I was or why I was kneeling on the bathroom tile like this. But then it came back to me. There was a giant dog and I saw it run like a man. How absurd. I must have hallucinated it, I told myself. I must have gotten food poisoning. What had I eaten for dinner last night? Something from a chain fast food restaurant. I decided never to go back to that place again. I still felt awful, but I had a sense of relief that this was probably all just a bad dream or a hallucination brought on by poisoning, and I was probably past the worst of it. Soon enough, I was back on my feet and feeling a little better, and I headed back to my bedroom, where the huge dog was standing in the window, slobbering all over the glass. It saw me and hatred filled its eyes. It looked at me like it was Rachel Maddow and I had voted for Trump. This creature had no respect for my existence at all, and it bared its teeth. I wanted to run. If it had been up to me, I would have run, but my legs were undecided apparently, as they sort of went weak under me and I had to catch myself in the doorframe to keep from falling. Seeing this, the Dogman seemed to grin wider, and then it roared. I guess my legs got their act together, or else I was just willing myself away from that room because I flew down the stairs to... where? Where could I go that the rabid dog couldn't get at me? I remembered the place had a basement, and the only entrance was the kitchen. I ran into there and was a bit surprised to see that the basement door bolted from the inside, as though it had been used before to hide from someone. Or something. The basement had no windows, and it took me some time to find the string connected to the lone, bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling. Some things scuttled away when the light came on, some kinds of dark insects. That's just great. I love insects. Okay, I hate insects. I looked around to see if there were any other ways in or out, and I was soon satisfied that the only place I might have to defend would be the door at the top of the staircase. There were no places to sit that weren't incredibly creepy and/or disgusting, so I sat up on the top wooden step, leaning back against the kitchen door, listening. It was mostly quiet from then on, but I would hear the howling come back just as I was about to fall asleep over and over again. I don't think I slept at all for the rest of the night. When I saw light beginning to creep in under the door, I knew I'd better risk taking a shower and getting ready to go to work. I was somewhat surprised to find everything in order and nothing disturbed within the house. I assumed the monster would have broken in through the bedroom window and trashed everything, but the window was intact, and it had apparently stayed outside all night. After my shower and some buttered toast, I was starting to almost feel human again, and I went out to my car and started warming it up, thinking about the crazy night I had just survived. In the sunlight, it was hard to believe I hadn't imagined the whole thing. I started to back the car out of the quote-unquote driveway, then remembered that it was a half a mile long, so I made a U-turn. Now at least I could see what was in front of me instead of what was behind me. In a few seconds, once we got under the cover of the trees, I suddenly no longer wanted to see what was in front of me, because it was the dog. Standing. Just standing. In the middle of the road. I hadn't realized last night how wide it was. I hadn't realized how tall it was. I hadn't realized last night in the dark how wide its chest and broad its shoulders were. Its front legs were like weightlifter's arms, and its front paws were immense hand-like claws. Its hind legs looked strong enough to carry an elephant. In the light of day, it no longer looked very much like a dog. It looked an awful lot more like some kind of werewolf. It was the Dogman. I slowed the car down and stopped about 30 or 40 feet away. My mind was rebelling against the idea of this nightmare from last night showing up in my daytime life. It just couldn't be. And yet there it was. The Dogman made an angry sound and started walking toward me. That was a quite upsetting development to me, and I put the car in reverse. I pulled back and the Dogman advanced. I decided to hit the gas, move backward fast, gain enough space, then make a fast U-turn and beat it back to the house. I got the first part done at least. As I moved the car into reverse, the monster leaped onto the hood of my car and I screamed and covered my eyes instinctively. Apparently my lizard brain never learned about what a windshield is. The monster banged on the glass and tried to scratch through, then jumped on the car roof. I could not take any more, and I illogically opened my car door and ran straight into the woods. I had been far safer inside and it made no sense to get out, but that monster so freaked me out that I had an irrational need to get as far from it physically as I could as quickly as possible. Of course, the Dogman chased me into the woods. I could hear it behind me, breaking branches and stepping on leaves and twigs. I could hear it breathing. It never got closer, but it never fell back either. It was letting me tire myself out, I realized. This thing had a plan, but I didn't. I needed to change that situation fast or I was going to end up as breakfast. The only thing I could think to do was double back around to the car and hope I could get back inside. I could never make it back to the house before that thing, and I wasn't really sure what was in these woods. I had a feeling the Dogman knew though. So double back is what I did, and when I was coming through the last few trees, it looked like smooth sailing back to the car. I didn't see the monster anywhere, and I wasn't hearing it anymore either. I was literally crying with fear, stress, and the beginnings of relief. I absolutely could not wait to get back in that car and lock all the doors. I cleared the trees and sprinted like a teenager straight for the door handle. When I got within a few feet of the car, the Dogman came out of nowhere and was between me and my vehicle. Now let me pause here to be very clear. I'm not saying the Dogman appeared in a puff of smoke out of thin air. I'm trying to indicate that he ran up from someplace I had not noticed him and arrived in front of me so quickly that it was almost as though he had appeared by magic. It was not magic though. It was muscle. The monster took a swipe right at my face and I moved backward, tripping in the process and landing hard on the asphalt. From the ground I looked underneath my car and realized that might be my best bet, so I rolled myself closer and slid underneath. This infuriated the Dogman, who reached underneath, tearing at my clothes but not doing much actual damage to me. As he'd move around to the other side of the car, I'd slide away from him, always mostly out of his reach. My expensive suit was being torn to ribbons, but all my body parts were still intact so far. It seemed to be more tiring for the dog than for me, and I was content to play cat and mouse with it until it fell asleep. Maybe I shouldn't say cat and mouse, since that thing was no cat. I was starting to feel like my brain was going to triumph over this monster's brawn when it demonstrated it was definitely an intelligent being. It jumped on top of the car and started bouncing up and down like it was on a trampoline. This created a most uncomfortable situation for me down below, as you can imagine. The car would pin me when it bounced down, and I only had a second while it bounced up in which I could slide. I managed to get over to one side of the car, and while the monster was jumping, I made a break for it and ran into the forest. I ran only 2 or 3 trees deep, then hid behind a tree, crouched down. I heard and smelled the Dogman race past me deeper into the woods. I counted in my head, 1, 2, 3, then back to the car I ran. The Dogman heard me before I was even in the car, and as I slammed the door behind me, it tried to pull it back open. I got the lock down just as it fumbled with the latch on the door, trying to understand how to open it. I started the engine and drove backward. The Dogman just watched, panting and catching its breath. I got far enough away from it and I slowed the car to a stop. Then I took it out of reverse. The creature regarded me. I stared at it. There sometimes comes a time in one's life where you have to decide if your life is worth fighting for and how far you are willing to fight to protect your life. At that moment, after a night of no sleep and ongoing torment all morning, I was ready to do anything it took to rid myself of this obstruction in the road. I put the car in gear and I drove forward. I pushed the gas pedal so hard I'm surprised it didn't push through the pavement. I didn't know who would be hurt more by a collision between my car and an immense Dogman. That thing must have weighed more than an adult male deer, and I know that those can sometimes total a car. So I was very aware consciously that I might be doing something suicidal. It had just reached the point where it was either that or give up. I had a sense of faith that I was doing the right thing. And I saw the expression on the dog's face change from one of anger and loathing to one of surprise, and even possibly a bit of worry. At the very last possible second, the Dogman leaped out of the path of my car in an athletic move that would have made any toreador proud. The Dogman was now quite literally in my rearview mirror, and I was out of that place. My boss was an understanding guy, and he let me take the morning off to get something else to wear and to calm down. I forget what I told him happened, a bear attack or a pack of dogs or something, maybe a bunch of groupies. I was kind of in a bit of shock, so parts of it are in a blur. But I managed to pull off the meeting we had scheduled for that afternoon with an important new client, and then I was back to trying to figure out what to do about where I was going to be sleeping. Obviously, that house was already claimed by the Dogman, and I was going to have to move. So I went home that night to pack. I was going to drive to a hotel or motel, whichever I saw first randomly, but I was so tired from not getting any sleep the night before that I laid down on the couch to take a short nap. I woke up the next morning almost late for work. The Dogman hadn't bothered me at all that night. The next night was also peaceful. Days stretched into weeks, stretched into months, and then years. I still live in that house today, over 35 years later. I've never seen the Dogman again. I have heard howling a few times, but it wasn't that weird, deep, singular kind of howl. It was something that sounded a lot more like a pack of coyotes. So maybe Dogman is the one who chased the previous tenants of that house out. I don't really know. But I do know one thing for certain. This tenant of the house is the one who chased Dogman out.
Thanks for watching till the end. If you liked what you saw, please consider clicking like on the video or sharing it. You can become a channel member by clicking the join link below. Then you can check our community page to find the links to 10 hours or more of secret, uncensored Dogman stories too wild to be told on this channel. Your other option is to join our paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com. That's Peter's homemade club, where he will personally email you the links as well as occasional secret club messages. You may also be included as an executive producer in a future episode. You have a scary experience you want to tell us about? You can email us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com, or else call our Scary Stories voicemail hotline at 804-LESS-SCARY. The machine cuts off every few minutes, so if you have a long story, please keep calling back and we'll piece it together later on. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.